I'm Dan Drake on Visitor Network TV. With us today is PeterBoyce. Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Dan.
Peter is an astronomer by profession who has morphed into a base scallop researcher. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you and Bob Kennedy worked together for a number of years on various scallop projects, scallop research projects, and now with Bob not being around anymore, you've pretty much taken a lead role in the research and in mentoring young people. So why don't you talk a little bit about your program that you've been working on at the Maria Mitchell, and then we can get into the research itself.
Sure. Well, this year we started a program to mentor high school students, which was kind of suggested by my assistant, Oliver Bender, Steve's grandson, who has now worked with me for a couple of years. And Oliver said, gee, I've learned so much. It would be great if we could teach this to some of the young kids coming up, going into college, some of the stuff you don't hear about in the classroom. And so I started thinking about that, and he and I put together this program. And we got a couple of local organizations to sponsor this, fellowships for the students and some money for the program. And got together this year.
Well, say who they are.
So, well, interestingly enough, the Fagawi race gives...
First of all, they're under the aegis of the Maria Mitchell, right?
Oh, the program is under the aegis of the Maria Mitchell, right. That's right. I'm a research associate there. So this year we had Abby Hines and Sophie Proch and Mackenzie Welch as part of the crew for this this summer.
Can you identify them sort of left to right?
Sophie Proch is on the left, and then Abby, and then my assistant Oliver Bender and Mackenzie Welch, and I'm taking up space at the end of the row. So the centerpiece of this whole program, well, I went around to sell it too. The Fagawi race gave some money, Nantucket Island Resorts, the Boat Basin gave some money, and for one of the scholarships we got money from the Nantucket Education Trust, plus some other donors. And of course, the Nantucket Shellfish Association has paid for.
Which, in full disclosure, you and I are both involved with.
That's right. But they have paid for Oliver Bender to be part of this program for the past 2 years, which has been great. But the centerpiece of what we try to do is individual research projects for the young kids. And that's takes on Maria Mitchell's philosophy that the best way to learn science is to do science. And so we had 3 projects this year. One was measuring the effectiveness of spat bags, which we use to measure the spawn of the scallops, whether they're better on the surface or actually down below where the eelgrass is.
And for years you've been having them on the surface, right?
Yes, because that's what, when we went to the folks at Martha's Vineyard, they said, well, we use spat bags on the surface, and so do a lot of other people. So we just started doing that. Well, Sophie Proch, her project was to put some spat bags on the bottom and some on the surface, and it turns out the ones on the bottom are about 7 times more effective than the ones on the surface.
What does that mean in terms of the habitat of scallops? Well, or does it mean anything?
You might expect that because the scallops, when they are first spawned, live in the water column as larvae for a couple of weeks, and then they drop to the bottom where they latch on to the eelgrass, and they can actually have a little foot that can actually move them up the eelgrass, get them out of the reach of crabs on the bottom. And so they survive a lot better if there's eelgrass or some structure like that the crabs have difficulty getting up. So you might expect that that's better, but for us it means that we get a far better measure of the spawn if we have more scallops in our bag. Instead of 10 or 20, we have several hundred. Well, in this case, we actually had 7,000 scallops per bag.
That's amazing.
So,
you measured them all randomly?
counted them by volume, put how many in a cup, of 400 of this big, and then we have how many this bigs there are. And so, but the downside is that they are smaller. They don't grow when they're that packed together that tightly, and about 15% of them actually died. So there's pluses and minuses to running bottom spat bags, but we might try some.
But wouldn't that be pretty much what life is like? Real life is like?
Oh yes, oh sure, yeah. Okay. But it gives us a better idea. It would give us a much better idea of the size of the spawn. We get a much better sample by putting them down the bottom, I think. So that's something really.
So this was presumably a pretty good year, it sounds like.
This was pretty useful, and yes. I suspect that these, from the timing and so forth, mostly came from a larval release that our town shellfish biologist, Tara Riley, made at the head of the harbor.
Okay.
So,
maybe it's not indicative of the actual.
Not indicative of nature,
spawn.
But it's indicative of the kind of harvest we might be able to have next year.
Next year.
So. The second one is a question that Abby Hines asked. She was very interested in, do these little mud crabs we have, which are not very large, do they actually prey on the scallops? And so we actually built some scallop condominiums. we have some for big crabs and some for small crabs. And we found that we put scallops in here, they swam out to escape the crabs. So we actually had to build put a top on it, and so you adjust the whole thing.
The crabs go in underneath.
So we put the crabs actually live in here because there's a screening on the bottom and screening on the top. We put one crab in there, and we put in 3 scallops a day to see if they eat them, of different sizes. We worked on larger and larger, and then we found that when you get about as large as the crab themselves, they just can't get into them. And their preference is to eat.
How big is the crab?
The crab is maybe 1.5 inches wide at most. And then we had some smaller crabs to go in the smaller, which is 1/2 inch crabs. Well, they could eat 1/4 inch scallops. And so it turns out that the mud crab has the potential to be a big predator of the scallops because there are so many of them. Everywhere you go around our harbor, we have these little black-fingered mud crabs.
What's the third one?
So the third one is the question of, do we have enough oxygen in our water? So we had a data logger that would actually measure the amount of oxygen dissolved in the water every hour. And Mackenzie Welch did that, and we found that we do have, by and large, quite a lot of oxygen. There's a tremendous variation between day and night, because when you have all these little one-celled plants in the water, and like in a algae bloom, when the light is shining, they're running photosynthesis and they're making oxygen, and so the oxygen in the water goes way up. Then at night, they shut down and they breathe oxygen and put out carbon dioxide, just like we do, and the oxygen drops. Well, if you have a night followed by a dark, rainy day, the photosynthesis never turns on and the oxygen drops, and a couple of times it dropped to near problematic levels. And so as we have more and more of these algae blooms, we have more and more risk of doing what happened in Narragansett Bay a couple of years ago, and that's having a huge fish kill because there isn't enough oxygen in the water to sustain the fish.